Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I'm joined by Jonathan Bratten, who is a military historian and National Guard officer specializing in the colonial era and World War I. His book, To the Last Man, A National Guard Regiment in the Great War, 1917 to 1919, received the Army Historical Foundation's Distinguished Writing Award for 2021.
It's really nice to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and talk about pilgrimages and World War I. I mean, who doesn't want to talk about this first thing on a Saturday morning?
Exactly. Who would, when choosing to spend time doing something, who wouldn't be doing this?
Exactly.
And then we also can throw in the YD and even more specifically, the 103rd. So I'm looking forward to this. I am interested to see what you brought to show us that's related to pilgrimages or your own particular pilgrimage.
So the artifact that I have today is this very ubiquitous piece of stuff that you find on any farm from the East all the way out to the American West, probably more than in your part of the world. But this is from a hillside in northern France where we experienced this together. We were out on I don't want to say chasing a lost trail, but it was a long day of a staff ride recon. And I said, hey, can we go look at this one spot? Because I think there's something cool there, maybe, possibly. And everyone was nice to humor me. And we're walking through the woods. And we're like, find nothing, and there's nothing and nothing. And I'm like, oh no, I've dragged everybody out here into the woods. We drove through a French like hunting party. We ruined like 2 rental cars. And I was like, oh no, there's nothing here. And then we start to go up this hill and we come across a post with barbed wire on it. And I'm like, uh-oh, that seems like something. And I got very excited and I reached down to touch it and it came off in my hand. And I took that as a sign that this needed to come back with me because when we got on top of the hill, it was this entire network of trenches and clearly had not been visited for a very long time. We found all sorts of stuff in those trenches. And this is a hill that was taken by the 103rd Infantry, Maine National Guard. And as I was walking through there, I just had this idea of I was probably, the last National Guard soldiers from Maine who were there were the ones taking it back on November 10th, 1918. So pretty emotional. I think I, did my best not to cry in front of everybody. But it was definitely a meaningful event that like brought the war that was 100 years old back to me incredibly personally. And so this is my artifact.
You talk about this date in your book, To the Last Man, a National Guard Regiment in the Great War. And being able to experience that with you was really cool. I had read your book. We had become friends by this point, and seeing your excitement in this moment and then being in the exact location where these soldiers were over 100 years before with the author of this book was really cool. And can you share a bit about a couple of those soldiers who were in this spot literally the day before the war ends?
Yeah, so those individuals who were fighting on that hill, it's kind of a remarkable collection of characters, really, that you have. So going up the hill, there's this first lieutenant from originally from Australia, Herbert Pert, who had received the Carnegie Medal a few years prior when he saved a young girl from drowning. He'd been a student at MIT, and now here he is leading his soldiers up a hill. And he pauses to write a note. He takes cover behind a tree. There's German machine gun rounds pinging everywhere, and he pauses behind a tree to write a note to tell his commanding officer where the machine guns are, presumably to coordinate artillery to take them out. And he says, I've identified these machine guns. I've identified this trench, this many people. And as mid-note, he's hit in the head and killed. And that's one of those individuals. Another is Moses Neptune, who's the eldest son of the Passamaquoddy Nation. They're a Native American tribe in eastern Maine, and he is the chief's son. He is destined to become chief, probably in his own right. And halfway up the hill, he is killed as well. And one of his comrades, also Passamaquoddy, is shot through both legs, carrying off another soldier from the company. The units that are the size of the unit that's attacking now is, I mean, down to around 200, 300 soldiers up, from they're starting of around 1,500 per battalion. So it's a skeleton unit. There's hardly anyone left. Everyone's on their last legs. The weather's terrible. And it's just a really awful experience on their last full day of the war, where they do end up seizing their objective. Amazingly, I have no idea how, considering it's, the trench stronghold was so well positioned. All the machine guns had, covering all the approaches. It was kind of stunning to walk through there and realize, oh wow, with just a handful of soldiers, they took this. It must have been, you read about it, you read the reports, because I've got all the field messages and everything, and it doesn't bring home the reality of seeing it and walking that ground and looking at the terrain that they're up against, and then remembering, oh yeah, it's horrific weather, diphtheria and typhoid fever going around. One whole company was quarantined, and they've been suffering from shell fire, poison gas attacks. Rations are really low because they've been on the advance for the past few days. Um, and then that's it. It's right after this. I think a soldier described it as going from hell to heaven in a matter of minutes, after 11 a.m. But even then, at 10:30 on November 11th, they get the order to attack, out of the positions that they just taken. So they have half an hour of, again, more hell. It's such a crazy transition for us to think about, how do people deal with going out of that high intensity situation, and then suddenly you're normal, like you're like, what, you're a normal person again, and then you think about your normal wants of, like, oh, I need food, and I'd like some fresh socks, and it's just such a wild thing to conceive of, standing on that hilltop, in the really middle of nowhere. Some wonderful French farmer owns it, gave us permission to tramp around in it. But it was such a meaningful place for me that I can't really shake some of those feelings still.
I think it was even for me, I'm coming into learning about the Whitey and the 103rd through your work, but then also thinking about the pilgrimages and the soldiers who had been there. This terrain was very difficult. We struggled at times just to get up the hillside, and it gave me, I think, the difficulty of the terrain brought home to me just how difficult this was for these soldiers. Not only the geography, but just thinking about that struggle to get to the top of this hill, was really, it was a really powerful moment for me also. How did you get into studying the 103rd? I mean, this is such, it's so niche, and thinking about being in northern France on a hillside, with two incredible stories you just told, one from the Passamaquoddy tribe, the other from Australia. Both of these people end up in the Yankee division and the 103rd, and then somehow you also end up writing about them. So how did all that come together?
Well, I didn't mean to. It wasn't on a long-term plan. It was back in 2014, I just gotten back from Afghanistan, and I'd taken over the position as the main Army National Guard historian, which I was like, dream job. Like, this is it. Like, nothing will be better than this. This is the best job ever. And I was thinking of that because I'm, a Civil War nerd. I was like, Joshua Chamberlain, 20th Maine. That's like, I get to tell those stories. And it was a day where I think I was waiting on my computer or something like that because, nothing happens unless you have a computer, and mine was like in the shop or something. And I happened to just start pick up like some of the stuff that was laying around. They didn't have a historian for a long time, so there was just boxes of things. I'm just going through boxes, and I start reading about this World War I unit, this 103rd Infantry, and I'd known about them. They were part of our unit heritage, and I'd read the campaign names God knows how many times on our lineage and honors without knowing what any of them meant. The Civil War, I'm like, oh yeah, I know I can tell you about every single one of these battles. World War II, a little bit of that. But World War I, I'm like, was Azen Marn? I do not sprechen the French. And now then I started reading some of the unit history, and I'm like, wait, these guys weren't just like over there. Like, they were some of the very first troops over there. And they saw, probably more varied parts of the war than any other unit. And they're this National Guard outfit, originally from Maine, and then brought in filled up with a whole bunch of guys from New Hampshire, and then a handful from Vermont and Massachusetts. And they're just experiencing some of the most traumatic and momentous parts of the American experience in World War One. So they are at the center of this. It's not like, oh, they were there too, which is sort of how I had seen it. And once I realized that, I was like, well, I'm addicted. I don't know what drugs I just took, but boy, I like that hit. Let's get some more. And I wanted to know more. I wanted to find out more. And as it so happened, the stuff began to turn up. I don't think anyone had, I guess, a very fertile field for research, because it was around the time of the centennial of World War One. So people were beginning to think about it. People were beginning to think, what do I have in my attic? What are the bits of mementos that I have from my family? And then also there was just, as soon as I began to talk about the 103rd or share stories, I would go do public talks around the state, or I would do like a Facebook video or something like that. And then people would contact me and say, oh, hey, I've got my great uncle's trunk. It's got his like war diary in it. Would you be interested? Yeah, obviously. And so I had, memoirs popping up, unpublished memoirs, diaries, whole collections, photos, letters, just like cornucopia of historic goodness. And that's when I realized, I was like, there's no way I can keep all these stories to myself. Like, there's so many stories. I need to put this on paper. And I need to share these stories. And luckily, the Army agreed with me, and Army University Press agreed to publish what became To the Last Man, a National Guard Regiment in the Great War. But it was really just driven by this crazy need to have like all these stories that were in my head, all these voices of people who, obviously long dead, whether from the war or just natural causes. Needed to get them out of my head, as crazy as that sounds, of just like, it was like their stories, they knew that their stories needed to be told, and like, hey, we found a guy, go tell the story. And so that's sort of like I said, that was never a thing. I never went into this being like, oh, I'm going to write a book about World War One. That was not a thing that I ever had a concept of doing.
So you write the book, and as part of the research for the book and also the outcomes from the book are these amazing opportunities to then visit the places where where the regiment and the YD overall kind of, you're able to go to northern France and follow in the footsteps of these soldiers. And part of that is through staff rides, which you and I have spent a lot of time talking about, how like this Venn diagram of staff rides and pilgrimages, and concluded that there isn't really a Venn diagram outside of individual experiences. Some people do experience parts of a staff ride or an experience during the staff ride as pilgrimage like, or maybe they're on their own sort of individual pilgrimage. But you become very connected to the land and the exact spots where these soldiers fought. At what point for you, as the historian writing about these soldiers, did it suddenly occur to you, or did it become sort of a personal pilgrimage of connecting the stories of the soldiers and the people themselves to the places that they actually were in France?
Wow. I think one, the connection happens before you even get to the ground. The connection happens so early, and I think a lot of times historians don't realize it. And I've talked to a number of other colleagues about, like, hey, do you feel emotional, like, or weird reading the letters and diaries of dead people? Reading the private thoughts of people who have been dead for a long time and you never knew, and yet somehow you feel like you know them, to the point where even though you know very well, you know that they're dead, you know that they died probably in the war, and yet, as you're following along their life, whether you're reading their letters or you're reading a diary, and you get to the end, it's an emotional hit again, even though you know all this. And you're just sitting there, just like taking emotional blow after emotional blow, going like, oh my God, am I going crazy? Like, why am I sitting in my office crying over someone who's been dead for 100 years? Because it takes it out of you, and you begin to see the people, the very human aspect of these individuals, and you do begin to feel like you know them. And so it begins there. And so when you're on the spot, it's like adding an additional dimension of this feeling of not just knowing, but almost beginning to experience things through their eyes, being able to see things as maybe they would have seen them. And that's, historians were supposed to be able to, gather information, analyze it, provide a synthesis, and some sort of summary and conclusion. And it's so hard to do that with people because you can't really do that with a human being. I mean, you can try. There's whole fields devoted to that, and Robert McNamara tried to do that to the Department of Defense in the 50s and 60s, and we get some weird things happening in the Vietnam. But you it becomes a shared experience with those individuals that you have now been brought into. And if you're bringing other people along, like on staff rides or a tour or something like that, you're bringing them into that shared experience. And that's where it almost becomes like this sacred thing, right? Of this thing that is so powerful. You are now bringing others into that with you, and with those individuals who lived it. And you find that if you talk to staff ride people who go on staff rides, and the one, like when you begin to go beyond just the tactics and the battles, and there's a corps commander and this division went here, and then this regiment, and then this battalion, but then when you bring it down to the individual and you say, so here's this individual, let me tell you their story, and let me tell you what they do here, and let me tell you about their, what happens after the war or not, because we're going to go see where they're buried in like the Musargan cemetery or something. That's when you get people going, oh, wow, I'm being part of something so much larger than myself. And that's where I think, we've talked about this. This is where you do have this almost shared aspect of a pilgrimage. without there, I think, having been any thought of, oh, hey, we're going to go on this trip to go learn about military history and bettering the profession, not like finding deep thoughts about ourselves and the meaning of what it is to be a human. I think it happens by I don't want to say by accident, but it is definitely a piece of the experience that I think, we don't, in the military, we don't really talk about that much. Right? The closest we'll get is we'll say to experience the quote unquote face of battle. Um, but I think at a deeper sense, it's much more to experience the part of a participant's own experience in that event.
There's many types of reenactment that happen within a military context, from reenactors reenacting a particular battle or series of actions during a historical time frame. And what you're describing is the reenactment of a human, like the all of the pieces that make us human, from our dreams and aspirations and thoughts about existential issues and our relationship with our families. All of those pieces come together when you're talking about being literally reenacting a human's experience in the world, especially those humans that you've learned a lot through the letters and through their own diaries. That's something different. That I think that's where the pilgrimagey piece, as I hear you describing it, that's where that comes in, is taking on the I say personality, I think that's part of it, but it's taking on the essence of a person who lived at a different time, but in a space where they actually existed.
Yeah. I mean, and there, I'm going to get into like, I'm a bad Catholic, as in I'm a lapsed Catholic or not a Catholic, whatever you want to call it. But, looking back at like Catholic heritage, if you look at the idea of the Mass, right? There's the concept of the Mass is that every Mass at the moment of consecration is a shared experience of everyone who's attending that with anyone who's ever been to Mass, with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, this historical event that is binding everyone together. It is a shared experience across an entire community of faith. And I don't want to, get too esoteric with it or delve into theology because I'm a bad theologian. Because I'm not one. But there is like this idea of like a shared understanding or a shared experience across time and space. And I think people experience that differently. Those who are, I don't want to say that they're open to it or they're willing to sort of see the past through human eyes rather than like I like to call it the black and white filter. If you just have the black and white filter on, then everything's old and nothing is related to you. It's just things that happen to old people in the old times, and they're not really real. And then you add color to it, and all of a sudden you go, "Oh wait, that looks like something that I would experience." It's this whole idea of like people don't fully understand something until you can make it relevant and real to them in their own world, or through their own points of reference. And I think that's one of the most important things that historians actually need to do, not just with staff rides or battlefield tours or site visits. I mean, it's everything, right? In order to, if we're going to do our jobs, we need to be able to convey some sense of what it was like to live in such and such a time, what it was like to experience such and such a thing, not to like sort of get a cheap thrill out of it, but to help build a historical empathy, we call it. This idea that there's you're not living, so disconnected from the past, and in fact you're living. Uh, the past is not even dead; it's not even past. To lay some tropes out there, but to help people feel that connection as they're either reading history or watching, however they're experiencing their learning. I think it's sort of our duty to do that, because otherwise we just have a really dry and honestly boring and uncaptivating work that no, it's not going to influence anybody.
I'm going to be thinking about this concept of the mass for a while, because I think it has, not only is it accurate, I think there is a lot of there may be some utility in just describing some elements of battlefield pilgrimages, of course, using religious terms. And I've kind of been on about this consecration piece and dedication. And so, so that might be a different episode where we can come back and.
You say consecration, and immediately, what comes to my brain is not just the Mass, but Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. We cannot consecrate. We cannot dedicate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who fought here have consecrated far more than our mere powers to add or detract. And that's like almost sacramental, right? It's saying like, we're not doing this. This
Yes.
isn't us. They did it.
Yes.
We're just witnessing it.
And this concept then pops up again after the First World War. This idea that the ground is consecrated by the blood and sacrifice of the soldiers who fought and died in these particular places. And so there are echoes then from this that come around again during this interwar period that very much inform the pilgrimages that are happening to the Western Front. One of these places, of course, is Belleau, and you and I both have such a huge interest in this and have dedicated a lot of our time and energy to looking at Belleau as a place of pilgrimage and also a place of memory. And let's dig in a bit to the Belleau, to Belleau Wood, to the village of Belleau, of course, to this pilgrimage site, which is the church. And tell me about your experiences in Belleau Wood and Belleau, and also, so what is it like to be John Bratten in these places, but also what does it mean to be a military historian of the 103rd in this place?
Woof, that's not a light question. So I mean, personally, that's the first World War I battlefield I ever went to. Back in 2016, I was in Paris for a few days, and I took the morning and afternoon, and took the train out, met Gilles, and he took me all across that battlefield. And I immediately was just, I don't want to say fell in love with, but it became a very personal connection. Because someone who studied, like me, I studied mostly the Civil War, and yeah, you can go to Gettysburg, you can go to all these battlefields. They are very well preserved. Many of them are well preserved. Many of them are parks, and I love them. I never get tired of going to them. But at the same time, there's this feeling of distance and separation, because it's curated mostly. There are park roads leading you to spots. There are monuments. There are plaques. I say most, because there's tons of battlefields where there's nothing for the Civil War. But And also, it's 150 years ago, so there's been so much change in the landscape. Then with World War One, though, there are no plaques largely. Roads tend to be farm roads, often the roads that were existing at the time, and you have a unique historical experience, which is to say that you are one of a very small group of people who's ever probably been to some of these places. Especially if you're looking at, someone that's not like the Lost Battalion or Sergeant York, who does it. They do get curated trails for them, no matter how. Of course, historians are going to argue about where those trails go and if they're the right place ad nauseum. But with World War One and the Yankee Division, you get kind of a uh, you get to have this feeling that you're treading new ground, and that was what Belleau was to me, and it still is. Every single time I go there, it feels like. Last time I was there, I went up. Oh gosh, hill. Not 204. 190. Hill 190. And I was sort of wandering around the woods. On the slopes and looking at shell holes, and it's all overgrown and everything now, so it's hard to see it as it would have been as clear. But you still get this idea that you are doing this thing for the first time, or you are one of the few to look at this with the same eyes that the participants might have, and so it's kind of wild. Like, it's this. You get to have this feeling as a historian. You get to have this feeling, this exhilarating feeling almost of like, oh, like I'm getting into something new. It's like, this is new territory. And then, like, as a person, it changes as you yourself change. And I don't know if you've had the same experience with going back to Belleau, but I like, I think as a younger historian, I got so into the battles, right? The tactical movements and the weapons and the equipment and who went where and what and why. And then as I've gotten older, my thinking changes and evolves, and I spend so much of my time wondering why people are fighting. Why are these young people over here fighting this war? And so then I want to go see what they have to say about it. And then once you're looking at what they have to say, you're beginning to look at things through their eyes a little bit more, or through the eyes of, I don't want to say someone who's jaded, but a little bit more saddened and sort of loaded up with context. um, and so sort of every time I go to Belleau, there's something new. There's some like new aspect that I see in it, whether it's, I'm seeing it through the lens of the soldier who writes about how most buildings in the town were just, the ones that were standing during the battle were hospitals, field hospitals, with surgeons and Red Cross medics operating under fire. And it's just such a hard thing to, it's such a beautiful, peaceful place. Like, it's so, you would almost call it sleepy or quiescent. Nothing would ever happen there, and yet you have for two, not just one unit, two significant units with the Marine Brigade and then the Yankee Division. It becomes this crossroads of identity, in that the Marines identify themselves with Belleau Wood. The Yankee Division is going to identify themselves with that same area, even though they're going to advance out of Belleau for 9 miles, but they don't really identify themselves with Epierre, Trogny, or anywhere on the Étrepi Plateau where they're advancing. They don't. They get all the way up to almost Croix Rouge Farm. They leave that to the 42nd. That's their identity. But they identify instead with so strongly with Belleau that they when they're looking at where they put in a division monument, it's, hey, let's rebuild the town church, and that will be our monument. Line the names, line the walls with the names of the war dead, and make it this small little piece of New England in France. And that's when so many people have decided to identify themselves with a single place, you do get that feeling that that place gets imbued with this power, very silent power. You almost always feel like when you go into Belleau, whether you're coming down the hill from Givry or whether you're coming up from Chateau Thierry, you do get this feeling of like this silent presence, this power that's just like sitting in this valley. And it means so many different things to so many different people. And as we've talked about, much of it is myth, but it still has meaning. Just because it's not true doesn't mean it doesn't mean something to someone personally. I can rag on the Marine Corps all day, and I do, of like, oh, hey, your Devil Dog Fountain, yeah, there were no Marines around to take that, and that was all National Guardsmen who took that. But for the individual, that doesn't matter. What matters is that that's an important piece of their identity, and I think when so many people place that power on a location, it's hard to shake that feeling from it.
I think you've actually, listening to you talk about seeing Belleau from a military historian's perspective has prompted me to think that my own experiences in Belleau and Belleau Wood are very much shaped by looking at this place through the eyes of the pilgrims who have been there, through the eyes and the feelings of the mothers who Mrs. Fraser, for example, whose son was a Marine, died on the east side of Belleau Wood. She left New Hampshire in 1925 to literally go find the ground where her son died. This is the message she left inside the cemetery registry. And thousands of people have come to Belleau and Belleau Wood seeking something. Many of whom have identified themselves as pilgrims. Of course, we know about the Yankee Division pilgrimage in 1929. These people were very clear about their intention that the dedication of the church, the reconstructed church, was a pilgrimage, and they identified very much as pilgrims. And so when I walk around the battlefield and when I walk around the village, I'm thinking about over 100 years of pilgrims that have come to visit places like the Pennsylvania Fountain and now the Devil Dog Fountain, and thinking about what they must have experienced during whatever time period they were visiting the place. And that also adds a level of humanity to the place, because for the people who were visiting, particularly during the 1920s and 1930s, they were grieving and they were trying to understand the loss within the family, the loss of a child, the loss of a brother, the loss of a son. And that, to me, that is, I can oftentimes get sort of overwhelmed by thinking about the anguish that these pilgrims were experiencing when they were in the exact place that I am walking in any given moment. I also think about how many people have visited the church over time since 1929, and what it meant to the veterans of the war who had paid for the reconstruction of the church, and thinking about what they experienced walking into this place as both a religious site but also as a division memorial, and how much this played a role for those people who were able to come, how much this played a role in how they then remembered the war. It's then through the eyes of remembering the place of the church as well as the collective experience of the division. So it's
it's a very special place, I think, for both of us. I'm even remembering a time when I was in the church, and I was in there by myself, sitting on one of the wooden chairs, when suddenly the bells, the church bell was starting to toll, and it went on. It sort of went rogue and was ringing for about 3 minutes. And I remember thinking, "Is this a message?" Yeah, and I remember texting you saying, like, "What if something is happening? What if the soldiers are here?" I mean, to me, it was not a stretch to make this leap into thinking about something kind of supernatural happening while I was sitting there, because it did feel like I was communing with all of these soldiers whose names flank the walls of the church.
No, it's not a far-fetched idea, because it's you get, with war a lot, you get people talking about things. It's hard to talk about war, because it's a uniquely human thing that's also entirely inhuman. You're asking people to go do things that people have been taught not to do from the time that they were children. Go do incredible violence, and so ways the people try to describe what this is like, especially for people back home, or just to posterity. They use sort of supernatural terms. Even just the Marine Corps, the devil dog image, this idea of conjuring up something from another world. And you get that often with artwork from Belleau Wood. It looks like this otherworldly place. People write about it. Seemed like you were in another world. You've got guys in the 103rd and Company E who write about being inside it. It's almost this oppressive place. Bits of soldiers blown up into the trees. The ground is entirely torn up. Everything stinks. It is just this hellish place. And so, to talk about this idea of it is not an earthly place. And so I think it's interesting that when we look at the post-war, and we look at going back and remembrance, the idea of remembrance becomes, we look to the same allegories, or the same sort of otherworldly response, because we don't quite know how to deal with the feelings of bridging time, because time's weird. Time is incredibly strange. 100 years seems like a long time. I like to point things out. We think 100 years is a long time. It's really not. My father was born in 1937. His father was born in 1901. My father was contemporary with Civil War veterans, and they would have been contemporary. Had they been in the U.S. Army in 1861, their commander-in-chief would have been General Winfield Scott, and Winfield Scott fought in the War of 1812 under President Madison, who's one of the founding fathers. So we've got 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. It's like 4 degrees of George Washington. And that, when you start looking at things that way, time shrinks profoundly, which is disturbing. I think to a lot of people, because we like to think, oh, that happened in another time. Everyone's changed. I think if you look at now and the discourse of the now, and people are like, well, how are, not to bring in depressing things into this, but how are some people sort of thinking the way they are? It seems like this is stuff from the past, and it's like, well, the civil rights movement in the late 1960s is not that long ago, and those people who marched both for and against are grandparents, and they had children, and they raised their children with certain values, and I don't think some of those go away. And this is to remember the World War I generation. These were people who were raised on the stories of their grandfathers in the Civil War, and there's this weird bridge of time. I guess the best way I can describe it is when I went to the Passamaquoddy Nation for the first time to go talk to them about these 6 young men from the Passamaquoddy who joined up in the 103rd Infantry at the beginning of World War I. And when you usually talk to people about their family members in World War One, you get a lot of, "Oh yeah, I think they were in there. I don't know. I'm not sure what they did. Was that what was World War One? Or they were Pershing's driver." And it's like, oh god, not everyone is Pershing's driver. Like Pershing doesn't have 500 drivers, but that's what everyone likes to. World War One, it's they were drivers for Pershing, and the Revolution they were part of Washington's bodyguard. It's like the pieces of the True Cross, right? If you put all the pieces of the True Cross together, you get this giant ship. Um, and so I went up to the Passamaquoddy Nation up at Pleasant Point, Maine, and I walked into the now of World War One, where family members were talking of people who they either lost in the war, who participated in the war, as if they just talked to them yesterday, as if it's imminent. It's like this closeness, which is so cool from a historian's point of view, and then from a personal point of view is almost terrifying, because it is taking that past and is bringing it into the now, and then you're a part of that, and then if you're a part of that, what does that mean? And yeah, I fully understand how sitting in the Yankee Division church, and if the bells started going, I'd be like, all right, well, Clarence Edwards is outside the door. He wants to come in and have a ghostly passing review with his soldiers. Sure, makes sense. Why not?
I was certainly interpreting it that way, because I thought, how many times does the bell just go rogue? And then I later learned it goes rogue all the time. But in the moment, it felt like this was a special sign from the YD soldiers to me sitting inside their shrine. And it was a moment of communing with these guys through time and distance. So you and I have talked so many times about the resurrection of a Yankee Division pilgrimage, in looking ahead at 2029 and thinking, how cool would it be to do a reenactment of the pilgrimage? And you had a chance to think about this in some definitive terms, and also conceptually, but also sort of mapping out what a pilgrimage could look like while you were working at West Point. And I want to hear a little bit about that, because there was like this rapid flurry of activity. You were unable to join the cadets because you had left West Point at the time that they went on this pilgrimage staff ride, but you were very much a part of creating this experience for cadets. And I want to hear what that was like for you, to think about the division and think about the 103rd in terms of creating a pilgrimage or set of experiences for students and for others. When you think about, because it's not like they just sort of went from point to point on a map. So you had to think about what were the important places in France for the division and the reasons why they were important. And so I'm curious about what that was like for you to develop this YD pilgrimage.
Yeah, and it was very different. I mean, because like you said, it is not simply you're taking a group of people who don't have a connection to the division, so it's not like planning something like we did for the centennial for division members of the National Guard from New England who at least had some sort of connection. Maybe they didn't know everything about it, but they could make that connection real easily by being like, or National Guardsmen from New England. Not difficult. Now you're asking a bunch of West Point cadets to care. Why should they care about this National Guard division? And so I put a lot of thought into how do I make this meaningful for them to tell the story also of World War One, of American soldiers in World War One. So not through the eyes of the 26th Division. And you start out with how do you get people interested? Well, you find connections, right? So first thing I did is I went and I found every single West Pointer who served in the 26th Division. There were a bunch of them. There's actually one I'd completely forgotten about him, but he came up 3 days ago when we were doing our bonus Army staff ride here in DC in Anacostia. Pelham Glassford who he commanded the 103rd Field Artillery in World War I as a West Pointer, and then the 51st Field Artillery Brigade. And then in 1932, at the time of the Bonus March, he's the superintendent of police in D.C. And dealing with all of his old comrades, and actually does a phenomenal job because he's got a lot of empathy for them. That's a whole other story. But there's a lot is sort of what I'm saying, and they have deep connections that go all over the place. So finding those individuals and then making their stories available to cadets so that they can see themselves now in this unit. And then the other was, what are the moments that defined the members of the division themselves? Not so much these moments that are big in American history, but what are the ones that they said, all right, it's here. This is the moment that means something to us. So the big sort of emotional muscle movements. You have the caves, the quarries, and the chemin de dames that all the soldiers write about. And it just becomes this thing that's embedded in their memories. And of course, Sèche-Pré around Toul and their first fights, looking at, how do, for me personally, as the 103rd historian, I'm looking at Zivroy and Marvasson, which is very meaningful. That defines that regiment in the spring of 1918 as their first really big major confrontation with the Germans. But for the division, they're most, it's Sèche-Pré. And so finding spots for cadets to go explore those existing trenches on the Toul front, to try to get an experience of like, hey, what's it like to stand here and have Mont-Sec like looking up at you, like the Eye of Sauron staring down at you. It's a psychological thing that soldiers wrote about, and so getting them to experience that. And then, of course, the next one is Belleau, because that defines the division. Everyone in the division lost someone that they knew or related to in those 10, 15 days along the Marne there. Just incredibly defining moment. And so you've got the cemetery, you've got Hill 190, you've got Belleau Wood and the trenches in Belleau Wood, and you've got the town, and you've got the church itself. And there's all these little bits, and I think I actually started them on Hill 204 on the backside of the Chateau Thierry French American Monument to get them to see sort of like the whole sector, and then walk from Hill 204 to Belleau. This was my concept of the best way to experience this area is on foot, and to walk down into Vaux and imagine it completely destroyed, as the 101st and 102nd Infantry experienced it, and then walk to Baresh, see the railroad station that George Dilboy takes before he gets his Medal of Honor action. That should have been included in the write-up. The fact that he just grabbed a couple grenades in his rifle and bayonet and was like, hey, hold my beer and watch this. I'm going to go clean out 2 machine guns out of this heavily fortified railroad station. And then to walk up the road to Belleau, seeing those fields around them and the stories of the 103rd attacking across there on July 18th, July 20th, and the supreme sacrifice, and just the horrible slaughter, the stupidity of World War I tactics, and then going into the church. So having this experiential moment as you're walking along, which is in and of itself, is a pilgrimage technique of that I wanted them to sort of have, and then also to experience their giant triumph at Saint Mihiel, where it looks like a cakewalk. Well, no, it was really just they learned so much from the Marne, and so to go to Hatton-Châtel and look out over the Rouve Plain and sort of see this moment of triumph for these individuals, and then also Verdun, and the area around Verdun, to experience that almost horror of that battlefield, and to go up the hill at the Bois de Vie to experience that last day in combat and what those soldiers must have been thinking and experiencing, the exhaustion, and kind of trying to encompass all of that. I think I actually put the Belleau walk at the end, because you can't really do it sequentially, time wise, because otherwise you're just driving back and forth across like 2 hours of France, northern France, and all just sort of looks the same and gets really annoying after a while. So I kind of front loaded a lot of the things around Saint Mihiel and Verdun, around the Meuse. And then at the end, after you sort of experienced all this stuff and you listen to people's words and you're in your feels, like you're in it good, like you're feeling the empathy, and then you walk from Vaux to Belleau and you walk in the church, and then you see the names on the wall, and then hopefully you sit there and you have a profound emotional and personal connection to these individuals that you didn't have before. That's what I hoped people would get out of that from the West Point staff ride.
I think they did. I was there at that final moment in the church, and I had a chance to talk to Major Rose Horswell a few weeks ago or a month ago about this, because she was also there. And the moment that I saw the cadets walking towards the church, I mean, it was a really special moment for me that I will never forget. Part of the reason I'll never forget it is because of the work that had been happening behind the scenes to reach this point, and how much care and attention you had given to ensuring that the steps along the pilgrimage staff ride were meaningful and they were moving towards something. And this thing, this idea that they were moving towards was this culminating event at the church to both have physically had this embodied experience moving through the terrain and reflecting on the soldiers who had been there before, but then ultimately reflecting on those who lost their lives, by way of seeing the names inside the church. And so these experiences do not happen by accident. Sometimes they can. There's an individual moment that happens, or some type of serendipitous kind of series of events happen, and people can have a profound experience. But this one wasn't that. This was because of the work and attention that had happened for over a year leading up to that moment, but also through all of the work that you had done in researching these soldiers and knowing the landscape yourself. So as a witness to that, I can say I think it accomplished what you intended it to accomplish. And it was a wonderful moment for me as a pilgrimage person and as a professor, and as a budding YD enthusiast, to see all of this come together in this moment. And in large part, very large part, it is because of your work and your efforts that had happened behind the scenes in the years leading up to this moment.
Well, I mean, I would say also you calling yourself a budding YD enthusiast is I'm pretty sure you're well past that point. I think we're gonna have to put you up there in the expert ranks. But it was also, I think so much of it was due to the conversations that you and I had had for so long. I mean, even before I went to West Point, of this overlap. And that's how we made contact and became friends. Was you asking about, hey, do you have resources on Gold Star and other pilgrimages? And me being like, not really, but hey, you want to hear some cool stories? um, and this shared idea that there's something important there. There's something meaningful. There is a through line that runs from World War One to the present day that it's hard to pull away from. it is sort of like this thing that binds you. You know, even right now, most of my work is done on the American Revolution, and always I'm like, okay, but World War One. When do I get back to do World War One? And it was just the other day, like I mentioned, we did this bonus army staff ride about the 20,000 World War One veterans who descend on DC in the summer of '32 to demand their bonus from Congress. The height of during the Great Depression, you have all these veterans and some of them with their families bringing there's women and children in some of these camps who flock from every state across the country, beginning in Oregon, coming here to DC. The guy who's overall in charge was a sergeant in the AEF. This is not like a thing that's being led by prominent members, but they have this idea, this commonality of a second AEF, which you can look at the 1927 Legion pilgrimage, and they saw themselves as the second AEF, and here you are just 5 years later, and they have what they call the Bonus Expeditionary Force, the BEF, and they break themselves down into units, and they have camps with rules, and they're living this sense of almost identity. In trying to get something out of Congress that recognizes their humanity as veterans who are hurting. And in the process of this, it was very funny because I was early in the morning getting ready for the staff ride. So the first thing that you get is your coffee, and then grabbing things, and I go to grab a pen out of my bag, and I reach down into my bag, and this is my usual staff ride bag, and I reach in to grab a pen, and I'm like, what on earth? And it's all this wheat, bits of wheat and chaff from the fields around Belleau, where last time I was there, I was walking down through the wheat field just next to the church, which happens to be where Company E of the 103rd attacked on July 18th. It took massive losses, and the individuals who I was walking for were the young men from the Skowhegan High School squad. There's a group of young men who all joined up together. They'd all gone to school together. Going to school with Margaret Chase, the future Margaret Chase Smith. One of them actually dated her. And then they, in the process of this attack, half of them are killed or wounded. And it's this incredibly emotional moment, and where it's the loss of innocence combined with a consistent desire to know what it was for on my part, and probably a little bit on theirs as well. And for me, that's what drives me to so many of these places, is to try to figure out, what was this for? Was it worth it? I don't know that you can ever answer that question. But anyway, so I'm walking through the field, and I just grab, the wheat is high, and it's towards the end of May, and I take a head of wheat, probably violating a bunch of French laws, and then of course bring it home with me, violating probably a bunch of international laws. So Interpol is going to come for me now. As this, because I'm an American soldier, and it's what we do. we take mementos from wherever we are to as a souvenir, as something to remind us. And then dummy me forgetting that wheat does not stay, an ear of wheat does not stay contiguous, especially if you put it in a bag that's being thrown all over the place. And so as anyone would guess, I go to open my bag after, like, the next time, and there's like all this chaff flies out. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, I forgot. This is not a good souvenir. It's not like pressing a poppy. This is just, it's everywhere. So I opened my bag just the other day, and I pull this out, and there's bits of Belleau wheat on my hands, and I'm realizing I'm going to go to the we're going to go drive across the river to Anacostia Flats, where the largest of the bonus army camps was, where there are veterans of Belleau. whether it's the 2nd Division or the 26th Division, who were taking part in this. And again, it's this through line that's just, it's vicious, and it catches you unawares, and it gets you like that emotional tug that you're like, oh man, I'm too early in the morning to have feels. And so it just like, I carry this around with, because I'm not gonna like throw it away. So it's just there. And occasionally it's like this little reminder that pops out at me, usually when I least expect it, um, of sacrifice, of what does it all mean, of this duty that I think a lot of military historians feel to carry stories with us and then share those stories. Um, they're one of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett, says, if you speak someone's name, then have they really died? And that's like an unspoken. I think if you talk to historians, they'll be like, yeah, no, I don't. That's not me. I'm very serious and academic. But then you give them a few drinks, and then you get the yes, I've cried over military rosters. I have felt emotion dealing with subject matter that is very difficult. That is my job. A military historian, your job is essentially to study one of the worst things in human existence. And it's not an easy thing to carry. And I think we don't talk about that as much as we should. I think that should be a sort of like, check in on your friends who are doing like Holocaust research, or who are doing genocide research, or who are doing war studies research, and be like, hey, you doing okay? Because it's not the most healthy thing to just sit there and read. I mean, I have to say the same thing about anyone who's doing Gold Star Mother research. Like, check in on you. Are you doing okay? Reading about these women who are experiencing profound emotional moments of grief over and over and over and over again. It's not something that just goes away when you close a book or you close your laptop.
I do think that there is an opportunity maybe to explore this a bit more in an SMH session or a paper around the psychological toll of doing this research, because for many people who are doing it, it is bigger than, it feels like a calling in some way. What you're talking about is bringing to the present that which happened in the past, and saying the names or describing the people that is keeping them alive. There's also, I just wanted to kind of tie this in also with the wheat that you brought back from Belleau. It seems to me that a pilgrim is one who embodies, they occupy a space in time that links something from the past with sort of bringing it into the present. And I think that these natural elements, in the case of Belleau Wood, whether it's stones or soil or tree branches, or wheat, which is so commonly written about and thought about, and the soldiers themselves and Marines talked about it. Bringing this with us, it is actually, it's an act of commemoration. Not only does the commemoration happen at the site where these events occurred and about the people who were there, but it's about bringing it forward into the present. So commemorating itself becomes an act. It's an action that brings something to the present. And so it's a beautiful example that you've just given about reaching in your bag and a piece of Belleau or pieces of Belleau are brought to the present. And the memories of those people who were in Belleau Wood or in the fields around Belleau are then brought into the present. So I think that this act of commemoration, it's commemorating. It is a present act, not necessarily something that's reserved for
the activities that happen around a monument or a memorial or a cemetery. It is the very act of bringing those soldiers, it's resurrecting the soldiers and the Marines and other service members who were present and bringing their memory into the present.
Yeah, it's I think why is one of the reasons I love being a historian, is because you do have that, and it's the easiest way to connect those currently serving with those in the past, because that's an easy. No one wants to be forgotten. I mean, everyone wants to believe that someone somewhere will remember them. It's in the the British do a really good job at commemorations, and they've got the great saying, at the Commonwealth countries, at the rising of its sun and at its setting, we will remember them. It's a very simple set of words that are incredibly evocative. The simple act of remembrance is such a powerful communal event that I think we've lost sight of a lot in the United States. I remember taking cadets on a staff ride to the Netherlands for Operation Market Garden, and we went to the American Cemetery in the Netherlands. It was right after Memorial Day, and that cemetery is unique because every single grave is adopted by a Dutch family. Every single grave and every single person on the wall of the missing, which is a lot. And at every Memorial Day, they come out, they do, maintenance of the gravestone, ABMC does as well, but, they make sure everything's clean. It looks nice. They leave flowers, they'll leave notes. They will bring their families with them to tell the stories of these individuals if they know them. The cemetery superintendent said that there's a long waiting list for people to adopt an American service member. And that's heavy, that you have 80 years after the fact, you have families who are still engaging in communal remembrance from this sense of gratitude to people who came to liberate them. And the main thing the cadets took away from it at the end was, why are they doing that so much better than us? Why aren't we doing that in the United States? Why do we have veteran cemeteries that are overgrown, that are not taking, or even if they are taken care of, no one knows the stories. I was like, that's a great question. I mean, we don't want to become, we don't want to become a society that's tied to the past, especially a military past. We don't want to become that society that is so rooted in our militaristic past that we can't look to a future that is peaceful. Because I think that, that way there be dragons, there be military autocracies that look a lot like Prussia, where a Prussian officer is walking down the street, everyone yields the way to that individual. You don't want a warrior class. That's not who we are. But there is something to be said for this act of communal remembrance, that whether it is because we have become less of a communal culture because of social media and the speed of the modern world, it is one thing, or it's simply because communal remembrance is difficult and it forces you to be uncomfortable sometimes, and people don't like being uncomfortable. So I don't know the reasons, but I do know that it is an important thing for helping people understand, if not the why, the cost, the price that you pay for military conflict, and to attach those humans to it and understand that these are not. I get frustrated all the time with all the Greatest Generation stuff, and I'm like, the Greatest Generation was drafted, right? Like, the vast majority of them went, they didn't really have a say in it, and that doesn't denigrate any of their service any less. But it removes the superhero status that we can give these people sometimes and just bring them to the very human side, which is important because then it becomes your story, it becomes your connection, and then you can begin to have the historical empathy.
You have talked about the work that you've done around World War I, particularly about your book To the Last Man, a National Guard Regiment in the Great War. And I know that you have other military history publications. What is an exciting publication that you have just released or are releasing soon?
It's been very cool in my current work with the Army Center of Military History, working a lot on the American Revolution. And, as much as I say I want to jump back into World War One, but I think looking at the revolutionary generation, especially the New Englanders, because you look at the 26th Division and they are just, yesterday to them is Lexington and Concord. Like they are firmly, and like that's their heritage. They're like, yeah, we started this thing, damn it, and they're very proud of it. Just the title of one of the division histories, New England in France. You're like, oh, subtle. Wonder what you want to talk about. This identity, and so looking at the revolution, looking at the specific moment in time, looking at who's serving, and it's a strong learning experience. And so my most recent publication was a co-authoring the first of the Army series on the Revolution. It's a 13 booklet series covering from the very openings, the why to why all this happens, all the way to the very end, Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris, and Washington resigning his commission. And so the first one is out, Opening Shots. You can find it on the Center of Military History website. It's free download, just like To the Last Man is. What I'm probably the most excited about, though, coming up in the next year or so, also through Army University Press, is this anthology on the history of how military, how law and policy around domestic use of the military has evolved from the colonial era to the now. And that came about because of just some research I was asked to do to look at actually adapting a sort of domestic response staff ride. And in the process, I was like, man, there's all these historical events that, we have this in law and policy and Army and Department of Defense regulation, we've got all this stuff on like how things work and who's in charge where and what happens when this. It's like a checklist, right? Like, because the DoD loves lists, and you got to follow things and check things off. Boy, how did we get this really sophisticated framework? And so the anthology is called Forging the Framework: History of Defense Support to Civil Authorities. Operations from the colonial era to the present. And it's really looking at how historical events impacted policy, legislation, and regulation in kind of some surprising and interesting ways to help us understand the other side of military service, this domestic side, all enemies, foreign and domestic, as in our oath. So I'm really excited about that one. And that should be coming out in the next year or so.
I look forward to reading all of them and very much appreciate you spending time talking to me today about your expertise on the 103rd and the YD and pilgrimages.
Thank you so much for having me on, and not just having me on, but for encouraging this incredibly meaningful crossover in the World War I historian community between pilgrimages, staff rides, and just the idea of service, and then people trying to figure out what their service means and how do they connect it to themselves and their wider world, both the individuals at the time and those present day. I know there's so many of my colleagues and friends who you've worked with who see their work now in a completely different light, and who say, will come to me all excited. They're like, "Hey, I found this new thing. It's so cool, based off of what Heather and I talked about." And it's opening an entirely new and unique field within World War One, American World War One studies, that I think can help serve future generations of veterans as people coming out of the global war on terror. We've got this 20-year period of service, and there are so many veterans who are struggling with what their service means, me included. And looking at how the World War One generation does it is so helpful, to see that there are others who are asking the same question, and who are trying to find these answers, and the ways that they're doing it, and the ways that they are incorporating these elements of spirituality, of pilgrimages, into it is incredibly rewarding to be a part of and wonderful to see. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing, all the work you've done, and everything that you will continue to do with the podcast, and all your endeavors. I don't think we thank you enough, is what I'm saying. You do incredible work.
It's been this post World War One, specifically interwar pilgrimages. I mean, the pilgrimages have continued up to present, but particularly this era of interwar, kind of 1920 really to about 1938. What we've all stumbled into together is amazing, remarkable. It's promising in so many ways, and I think it has created a lot of energy and inspiration about how we move forward, looking at so many different dimensions of pilgrimages. As I keep saying, it's literally the gift that keeps on giving. Every day I'm learning more about the pilgrimages. I hear from people like you and Aaron and others who are also learning more about these pilgrimages, and so I think it's going to be fantastic to see where all of this continues to lead towards, because it's really kind of now gaining some momentum.
Absolutely. Well, this was a delight. Anytime I get to talk about the Yankee division, I'm a happy person. So thank you so much for having me on.